At the University of Nottingham, we are leading the world in relation to the application of arts and humanities in healthcare, health and well-being. Health humanities actually started at Nottingham, and now centres for health humanities are spreading around the world. The key focus of health humanities is how not just health professionals can begin to work with the arts and humanities for healthcare, but also how the wider public, the self-caring public and informal carers can benefit from this kind of work. As you see down the bottom, the International Health Humanities Network is up and running for several years and is the leading body worldwide for this kind of work. As we know, mental illness is a big challenge for society, not just our own society, but if you like, societies around the world. It's a major impact on public life, on the health of families, and also our overall performance both as society and economically. So Creative Practices Mutual Recovery has made already an interesting contribution in terms of focusing on how, apart from medicine and medical interventions, from psychiatry and from psychology, how we can move forward with the arts and humanities as a key part of our work.
The Clay Transformations Project is a new idea. It's been funded by the University of Nottingham, and we're trying to work with artists, practitioners who are working with children and young people. We've got links with the Nottingham Contemporary. So we're developing a team from the university, from the NHS and from third sector to develop some new ideas, some radical ideas about how we can use clay to transform the process of therapy with children and young people.
Talking about clay transformations as mutual recovery, I don't know how many of you have had the chance to play with clay. There is something quite unique, and we don't know if it's the texture or if it's the earthy. It's a bit like pottery or gardening. You always feel good about it afterwards. So Gary and his team, they wanted to have a bit more scientific approach. So they did a few studies try to understand why clay is such a therapeutic medium.
One of the ways that clay might be working is because it inhibits people when they're working with the clay, and that's therefore why it's so effective, because basically they're more likely to tell you things because their inhibition is reduced.
My piece for your delight and delectation today is entitled Genealogies of Mutual Recovery. I'm taking my cue from somebody called Michel Foucault. There he is down there, lecturing away at the Collège de France. The idea that if you want to understand a concept, you've got to dig into the history of it. Foucault is often associated with an approach called the archaeology of knowledge. To understand ideas, you've got to understand how people built them, how they struggled over them, how they reflect the operation of politics and power. Part of the, if you will, studying the history and the archaeology of the notion of recovery highlights the way that notions of illness, medical hegemony, medical leadership in a sense, is left more or less intact. Even though people say things like, oh, it's about having experts on tap rather than on top. The conceptual primacy of medicine is left more or less unchallenged. It also means that people are encouraged to focus upon their, if you will, their inner psychic life, on things, and I'm sure we've all heard about them, you know, self-esteem, as a locus of control, self-efficacy, you know, personality dimensions, things like, ooh, you know, extroversion, introversion, neuroticism, you know, those kinds of things, rather than thinking about the socio-political and economic context within which distress occurs and is sustained. It's very difficult to think your way out of poverty. It's very difficult to think your way into a job in an era of mass unemployment. It's very difficult to think your way satiated when you're starving, and so on. And yet the notion of recovery plays scant regard to these broader socio-political contexts.
This group is a group of women that have all had children, and so we're going to make artwork about their experience of giving birth and the early years of parenting.
This is the Birth Project, and just to mention our research questions, which are: what role might the arts and humanities engagement have to play in pre- and antenatal care and provision, especially where post-birth trauma is being translated into bodily symptoms? And another of our research questions was: to what extent are iatrogenic clinically related birth practices implicated in postnatal distress? So in simple terms, that means iatrogenic practices are illness-inducing practices which are widespread within health regimes. And the most obvious example of an iatrogenic practice would be supine birthing postures, women lying down rather than being mobile during the birth. So that would be the most obvious one, but there are lots and lots. So what we wanted to do is produce qualitative data which explored women's experience. And we wanted to explore also what's distinctive about an arts-based practice rather than, a social support group. So what is distinctive about using the arts rather than other forms of support? So those are our research questions, and we're editing the films to try and address these questions. And this is one of a set of films that we've produced.
I had a C-section with Sam, and he was taken away, which I understand why they had to do that, gave him some oxygen, but it felt, I don't know how long it was, but it felt like forever. And there was this really weird thing in me that when they brought him back, I wasn't 100% sure he was mine.
My name's Lisa Watts, and I designed and facilitated those workshops. So there's two things happening. First, we were getting them to think in a kind of sculptural, what I'd term as a kind of formal or modernist way of thinking about objects and materials. And then secondly, you're thinking more of a kind of issue-based, personal, lived experience way of thinking about objects and materials. So in week 5, 6 and 7, we went through those birth stories. And they're telling their birth stories from those 4 weeks of practicing with objects and materials and thinking about what cultural meaning means, and then they're delivering their birth stories, but within this framework of their objects. So when I'm filming them, there's 2 films that are happening there. There's Eve and Jackie, who are filming the whole of their body in situ. Then there's me, and I'm filming just their hands holding the objects. So when I was looking at the clay work, and I was thinking about this idea about how people are expressing themselves through touch and manipulation of the clay. Similarly, the women are thinking about their birth stories while holding their materials and objects which have so much imparted meaning for them. And that's what they're using as a kind of way of taking themselves through the journey of the narrative of the monologue.
I don't know where that quote comes from about long-term abandonment for the baby, but I have a friend who said to me, if you have a C-section, you won't bond. You won't, what was the word? Yeah, you won't bond, there won't be all those hormones. And I was so angry because I didn't have any choice about it.
Women have reported that they found the experience, tremendously useful. The Mutual Recovery event at the end was 2 groups. We haven't talked about that and it's not mentioned in the film, but we did run a trauma group facilitated by a registered art therapist, so that was structured rather differently. But the end event was those 2 groups coming together. And the women report that they found it very beneficial to them, and a number of them have actually developed an arts practice. It was very heartening at the recent event to to hear them come back and reflect on how positive they felt.
Could you say a little more about the drama that you did at Derby Theatre, just for those people who may not be aware of the variety of your work in this area?
Yes, we're producing a kind of suite of resources, if you like. And we commissioned Third Angel Theatre Company to work with a number of interview transcripts, which included dialogue from obstetricians, dialogue from nurses, fathers' experience of being at the birth. And so they produced a dramatic piece based on those discourses. So that was a very interesting piece of work. We've also run a group with birth professionals, so that they're exploring the birth experience from the point of view of being a medical practitioner.
There is no other life experience that has this effect on you, and it's quite unique and amazing in a lot of ways. But getting it right makes such a big difference, doesn't it? And even when things go wrong, there are still things that people can do that will help you recover. I guess that's kind of why it's worth talking about, really, isn't it? You know, and it isn't about massive, expensive interventions, is it? It's just about somebody having a moment to tell you their story and listening.
Project that I've been leading, it's been in partnership with the Workers' Educational Association, and we'd like to take this opportunity to thank Susan for organising this event and also leading the funding proposal that made the making of that film possible. And to give some brief background about it, it's concerned with the mutual processes through which various creative practices in adult community learning and participatory arts settings affected well-being and mental health recovery. And the creative practices that we looked at specifically were painting and drawing, jewellery making, and also creative writing. And we looked at both provision that is targeted for mental health and sort of mainstream or non-targeted provision, as we're in some ways looking to blur these kinds of boundaries really between what may be considered sort of mental health issues or those experiencing mental health issues and those not, and looking at the notion of well-being as well as recovery within the project. So I just thought I'd start with a quote there, which is from one of the targeted art groups, which one participant said, well, we need to kind of get out there in the community and say this is what's helped. This is a campaigning image from the WEA, illustrating rather what are often referred to as the wider benefits of learning, and that is its sort of value beyond its direct impact in economic terms, but also thinking in terms of sort of ripple effects beyond those actually attending the provision, family members, wider community and so on. And you can see that well-being does feature in the tree there. In addition to that, of course, mental health is very significant in social policy terms at the moment and is also an area of targeted provision for organisations like the WEA, as I've mentioned. And I think the illustration highlights the policy issue of the balance between meeting an economic, employment and skills agenda and the wider social contribution of adult learning. And of course it's the former of those which often tends to be prioritised in policy terms. So moving more specifically to the mental health and well-being agenda, one key issue there is participation and inclusion. And what we found in our research was that people often saw a particular role for creative practices in that way. One manager of a wellbeing centre where one of the courses was running described it as a hook to encourage initial educational participation among those seen to be potentially socially excluded or educationally excluded.
And digital dialogues, as the title may suggest, is principally about storytelling, which is I came to a number of years ago through my work in theatre and drama, but has since sort of mushroomed into all kinds of things. But I only say that because I'm not coming from a medical background or a healthcare background at all. I'm coming from a performing arts background. So the first thing we did was identify what I think we've rather unfortunately in our own discourse called triads. And we don't really mean triads in the sense you might think. We're thinking of groups of 3 people. So the health service provider or the health service professional, which in our case is usually a GP or a psychiatrist. The health service user, which is, we've been concentrating on people with low-level incidences of mental health issues, and the carer, which is usually an informal carer, in fact always in our case, an informal carer, and usually a close friend or more commonly even a relative. And those 3 people form what we said was a triad. What happens is that when somebody posts a story, the other members of that triad are encouraged to respond with a story of their own. Okay, so the idea is that one story leads to another.
My name is Aaron Williman. I'm based at the Royal College of Music, and this is my colleague Sarah Cinto. We're going to do a double act today, presenting the aims and the rationale behind group drumming, the methodology and the methods that were underpinning our research, the preliminary results, and also a little bit of what's next. Just to say before we get going, we have very much been looking at group drumming, and we focused in on drumming in particular because we didn't want necessarily to get bogged down in trying to teach fine motor skills to participants who are coming into workshops. But it's interesting as well that we were looking not only at mental health service users within London who were taking part, but also their carers, but also importantly for us at the Royal College of Music, those musicians who are out there who are pretty much striving to get onto the stage of Wigmore Hall, and we wanted them to strive to do something else in life, and in particular to make a difference to other people. We are looking at the possibility of achieving a meaningful and more resilient life, irrespective of mental health symptoms or disabilities. And we really do want this recovery to be mutual and facilitated by musical practice. If you might think that music is a good thing. A lot of people listen to it. A lot of people pay a lot of money to listen to it, to engage with it, to make it. It just so happens that when with professional musicians, there's a very high degree of music performance anxiety. They also tend to report a lot of injuries and ill health. So we are particularly interested in trying to get those young students who are aspiring to be professional musicians to engage with other things in life.
We learn how to listen, we learn how to interact, we learn how to memorize repertoire. Some of the repertoire is traditional African repertoire, and some of it is repertoire that I've adjusted to this workshop. But most of all, it's important to have fun together.
So what were our methods? We had a mixed methodology. Before they started, before session 1, we collected saliva samples. This was to look at cortisol and 8 cytokines or biomarkers of well-being. Those were divided into pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines. We had physiological measures, heart rate and blood pressure. We had a sample for interviews that was representative of the groups that we had there, and we wanted maximum variation in that sample as well. So different ages, different relationships with music. And then we had a pack of 4 questionnaires. Those were the Work Endure scale, Connor Resilience scale, the Secker scale for social inclusion, and the HADS, the Hospital and Anxiety Depression scale. So after session 1, we repeated the measures of saliva and the physiological measures. And during the 6 sessions, we had 2 observers, 1 participant and 1 non-participant. So one person was drumming with the group and reflecting on all the process and you know, having a really close look at the interactions, at connectedness, at nonverbal behavior, all the communication going on. And then once in a while would come out and just, you know, write quick notes and then come in again. And then we had a non-participant observant outside of the session doing reflective commentaries on the session as well. And our musicians, they had diaries every week of their experiences. And here we wanted to know not only an overall assessment of their well-being, how do they feel, but also a moment-by-moment assessment. And we know from research that this is very different. Our perception of overall well-being is very different from a moment-by-moment X-ray. So we wanted those 2 inputs. And then in the final session, so session 6, we had visual analog scales, so scales with polar ends where people had a continuous line, and from sad to happy, they just had to put a line where they felt they were at that time. We repeated the saliva and the physiological, and then after the final session, we repeated all the measures, and we invited the people that were interviewed before to come again. As well as we run focus groups as well. I just wanted to say that this design with interviews pre and post intervention was quite unique for music interventions, and the reason why we did this is because we wanted really to see the meaning of change for that person. So not only how the change looked like, but how the change looked like in context for that person, which for us was very important.
This project is just amazing. It's just amazing. It's made such a difference to me as a person. And my family, when I come home, they can see how happy I am.
Oh, I love it. I've been trying to get in for weeks.
So if we look at our questionnaire responses, this is across the six-week period. What we actually find are significant changes in resilience, the Connor-Davidson, in reports, self-reports of well-being, the Warwick Edinburgh. We find no difference in SECR, no difference in the hospital anxiety depression scale for anxiety, but we do find a significant decrease in the depression scale. So that's over the 6-week period. But, and we can make this argument that music and music making will make a difference to people's lives and can make quite a tangible difference to people's lives over that period. But we also see across a single session changes in how people were engaging with aspects of mood and certain emotional states. So we saw reductions in 2 negative aspects over a 1-session period, and these reductions were in tiredness and stress, and a significant increase in other more positive things such as relaxation, happiness, and energy levels. We didn't find the decrease in stress across session 1. So this is across the beginning to the end in week 6. In week 1, there was no difference. People are coming into a new group, they're meeting new people. You can imagine why we may not have found that. Okay, let's move from the psychological to the biological. We actually find here, and Sarah mentioned that we were looking at both anti- and pro-inflammatory responses in cytokines, and we see here significant decreases in pro-inflammatory response across 4 of the biomarkers that we observed. And this is suggestive of enhancements in aspects of immune function. We also, across a single session, found many of these, in fact more responses here. We did not find significant decreases in a main stress hormone that we were looking at, which is cortisol. But it's very interesting actually that we find these significant changes in immune function across the 6-week period.
Do you know whether that increase in well-being or feelings of well-being are down to the physical activity of drumming, or the I don't know, the auditory experience of the rhythms, or the fact of being in a room with a lot of people doing something together? It seems to me there might be lots of different good aspects of that.
We will be able to address some elements of this through the phase 2 work package, where we have just a single session with people coming in who are actively drumming, listening to drumming, listening to something else, other than anything musical, and
stories.
and then listening to a live performance and listening to a recorded performance. So that's one session, and so we would like to do more projects that look at the social facilitative part of it, the physical facilitative part, and to tease those out.